Linux Luddites, episode 73, for the 7th of March, 2016. Hello and welcome to Linux Luddites, the show where we try all the latest free and open source software and then decide that we like the old stuff better. I'm Joe.
I'm Paddy.
And I'm Jesse. And in the news, we boiled down Mobile World Congress to its most pertinent parts, so that does come with a warning, there is going to be phone chat ahead. We cover the two big brouhahas making the news, Mint's site hack and Ubuntu's bundling of ZFS in 1604, and all the rest of course. And following the news, we cover Joe's trip to pick up the new Raspberry Pi in person, and then like the middle of a tiddly-pom apple, we look at TinyCore, a Linux distribution that runs in RAM. But with that, should we get on with the news?
Yeah, let's do it. So as Jesse said, let's start with Mobile World Congress. And Canonical were there showcasing their Ubuntu tablet.
Yes, we covered this last fortnight, and it was announced to be released, which is the thing that seems to go on with Mobile World Congress. You say it's coming before you've even announced it. And then there was quite a few people looking at it, and not only the tablet, but also their new high-end phone. And there were quite a few positive reviews, but unfortunately, there are also quite a few that weren't so positive.
Yeah, it's funny there's been this mixed reaction. Some people are really wowed and amazed by the idea of convergence. And it is quite impressive. This tablet, the Aquarius M10, does look quite impressive. But then there are some realists out there who look at it, and there's an article from The Verge that we can link to, which pretty much says it's just not good enough. It is fairly impressive, but it's not going to compete with Android and iOS. And now even Microsoft are getting into, what do they call convergence? They've got another name for it, haven't
Continuum.
they? Yeah, Continuum. And it just feels a bit too little too late, and they're just not a big enough player, according to this article anyway from The Verge. So it does remain to be seen. And our experience wasn't that good, but I think it will be a better experience on this Aquarius tablet, and I would love to get my hands on one. And I see these competitions on Twitter, take a picture of your laptop case, but my laptop case is pink, so I'm too embarrassed to tweet about that.
But perfectly happy to say it out loud, yeah?
It's purple, actually. It's not pink. Well, I don't care. It was cheap. It was whatever off eBay. My laptop fits in it.
I mean, one of the things I've heard people say about all this conversion stuff is something Jesse actually mentioned last time round, and that's the fact that you're going to have lots of cables and bits and bobs with you. It's not as if you can just take a device out and your screen magically appears on the nearest television or something. You're going to need to be carrying around a keyboard and cables and various bits and bobs, and that kind of detracts from the whole experience. And I think that's one of the things that people are being realistic about and realistically picking up on now.
Yeah, if you've got a dock that you can plug, whether it be an MHL cable in or something else, and it recognizes it and the dock becomes the keyboard, all very well and good, but you're not going to lug that round, and you can't guarantee that everyone is going to have one. So yeah, as you say, we covered it last time. I think it's very much a case of, if the infrastructure is there, i.e. your home and your work where you go all the time, it makes some sense. But to think that you can just drop in and start using a phone or a tablet as a desktop, unless maybe you could cast it, if you could sort of cast the screen, and because when you plug in the converged device using Ubuntu, the screen becomes the mouse pad and also becomes a keyboard when you want to input text. So I wonder if you could sort of cast the screen and then use the phone as the trackpad and the keyboard as well.
Well, that is what Popey says Ubuntu are working on. And imagine if you had just a small Chromecast size dongle in your pocket that you plugged into the TV. I think that would be acceptable and certainly would remain useful. And as you say, you can use the screen as a touchpad already. You can bring up the on-screen keyboard. So I think that you need to go through this wired step first, as we have with everything, with network connections. They were all wired first. And once you get through that and get that working perfectly, then you can move on to wireless. And at that point, that's when it's going to take off. That's when it has the potential to really become mainstream.
Yeah, I think so. And if you say carrying a dongle around with you, one thing, which is far easier, obviously, than a keyboard and a mouse, but if you could just cast it to existing Chromecast, I mean, most people, that's maybe a bit of a generalization, but I know many norm kind of people who have Chromecast and absolutely love them. And so if you could use that system, I don't know whether there's some sort of Google API that you have to go into so you can't do it. But if you could use Chromecast, that would be a really good way of getting this working and really practical in the real world.
Because we've been talking about ARM devices when we've been thinking about convergence from Canonical. And that isn't the only option. Well, it doesn't look as if it's going to be the only option going forwards, does it?
Yes, this is Intel, who had a phone that they showed off at Mobile World Congress, and it uses an X3 processor, so it's a standard Intel processor. I get the impression it's all new and shiny because they basically made their own device, and no other manufacturers have actually signed up to start building them. But the two impressive things about this is the fact that it runs on a Linux stack, so you're basically having Android on top of it, but you also have a Debian stack on top of it as well. So they use the same kernel and just these two different stacks. So when you're using it as a phone, it's just running Android. And then when you plug in the connector, I think it's just an MHL, it will switch over to show a simple sort of Debian on the screen that the MHL is connected into. So it's another idea of convergence. They probably have some fancy name for it. But the impressive thing, aside from that, is that it's looking like it's sort of the $100 end of the market, which, if they can get it running smoothly, is a really low price point for that level of technology.
As I mentioned at the top, I think one of the important things here is this is actually x86 architecture we're talking about, not ARM.
Yeah, it opens up a much wider range of software that you can run on it, although well, increasingly less so. There seems to be increasing numbers of applications ported to ARM. But if you do get a decent x86 processor doing this, then you have genuinely got a desktop replacement. And so this is almost more exciting to me, although I wonder how they're doing this Android and Debian thing. Is it just a cheroot environment? And if so, it's not quite the same, is it? Whereas surely it would need a reboot, which wouldn't be practical to actually get a proper bare metal Debian running. So I'd definitely like to hear more about this going forward, especially if there's an actual product available rather than just, well, it's a trade show, isn't it? Mobile World Congress. So it's just they're trying to sell this idea by the looks of things. So hopefully some of the OEMs will be interested in buying into this idea and we'll get some decent machines running it. And I think if it's possible on a $100 phone or device, then a $300 and $400 device will probably do it incredibly well. So this is quite exciting to me, but only in the kind of medium to long term by the looks of things. We're not going to go out and buy one in the next month or so.
Yeah, what was your overall impression? Because I mean, you said this is potentially exciting. Other than these couple of devices we've been talking about, Mobile World Congress seemed very dull to me this year. I mean, there was a bit of hype around Internet of Things, obviously, and virtual reality. But it seems very much as if the actual mobile phone market has ground to a halt, and it's mature, basically. It's where we were with PCs a good few years back, and there's very little innovation there now. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing.
Well, I don't either. We've got a situation where even a relatively old phone like a Nexus 5 is perfectly capable of running the latest version of Android and the latest applications. And so do you really need to buy a new one? And I think that is a big issue for these phone manufacturers, that in previous years, they have got significantly better. And not just on paper, the actual experience has got better and better. But now we've got to 1080p plus into 2K and 4K screens, which are just ludicrous, a complete waste of money and battery power. And they're just trying to add these extra features, and they're not actually adding any value to the user experience, are they? So you're right, Paddy. We are mature, and the only way to stand out is to do things like convergence or continuum.
Yeah, I guess if you were to look at the TV market 20 years ago, and there was the move from the massive, what are the old monitors called? I've even forgotten them.
CRT.
Oh yeah, CRTs. And And so they obviously move from those over to TFTs and then LED and then OLED. But once you get sort of the LED versions, let's say, you see them static for a number of years. And once the technology is mature enough in that field, they start doing weird things, curved panels and lights out the back and larger displays just to try and find something to make it new. And when it comes to mobile phones, you basically want as big a screen as possible with as small a bezel as possible, as all you end up with is a black square that's slim and got edges. There's very little to really distinguish them. I think I saw an LG that had one of those low energy e-ink sort of displays just at the very top for notifications and things. And that one that has the e-ink on the back as well. Whether they're useful or gimmicks, I think they're just trying to show that they've got something different, and therefore, like you say, it's a clear sign of a mature market.
Well, whilst we're talking about the blurring of the mobile and the desktop environments, let's return to Remix. And Jide, who is the company behind Remix OS, has announced an official partnership with the Android x86 project. And the founder of Android x86, whose name I won't even attempt to pronounce it, and if you guys want to, said, quote, "This partnership is a natural fit since we both strive to make Android PCs a reality. Remix OS seeks to create a familiar experience for Android users in a PC environment, and the Android x86 project has laid the foundation for this to happen." Now, apparently both projects will continue to be independent, even though they'll be closely working together now. And it looks as if the first sort of fruits of that relationship have already appeared. There's a new beta of Remix OS that's been pushed out that's based on Android x86. And that's fairly notable, I think, in the space for having both 32 and 64-bit versions. And it's providing UEFI support as well as BIOS support. You can install it to your hard disk as well as onto flash sticks. And it's also got an over-the-air update mechanism. As far as I know, they still haven't come to any arrangement with Google to include Play Store services actually within Remix OS at the moment. But it's all looking fairly promising, isn't it?
Well, it would be if it wasn't for their EULA. Now, when we talked about the Remix Mini, we kind of, I think, glossed over the fact that it's proprietary. But one thing that we didn't mention was their EULA, which I don't know if it had this at the time, but now it says, "You agree that you irrevocably waive any and all ownership, legal and moral rights to your user content." Now, that does not look good.
Yeah, that is a worryingly large catch-all kind of phrase, isn't it? Of anything you do is going to be in their power. That's quite a worrying one.
But is it good news for the Android x86 project? Probably, I would say, if they have the developers from Jide helping them out on it. And they always seem to be about one version behind, don't they, Android x86? Usually, well, I think when Android 6 came out, they released 5 point whatever. So it would be good if they could release them more quickly. But what worries me is the potential of Android x86 becoming proprietary, which nobody wants.
Yeah, agreed. I do have a question. Wasn't there some issue with these two people? I thought they were at each other's throats a few months ago. Or am I thinking of the wrong group?
No, that was the Android x86 project having a bit of an issue with some guys called Console OS, which was a Kickstarter to produce a very similar thing, and they claimed that they were just ripping all their code off and actually producing very little of value on top.
Oh, right, yes. Yeah, that's right, okay.
I think it would be great if we did end up with effectively two versions of Android x86, one for touchscreens and one for the desktop. But I think that Jide, well, all they have is their intellectual property here, isn't it? Their proprietary skin on top of Android. So it seems unlikely that they will open source it. And another company who are unlikely to release the source code for their OS are Jolla, or Yola, never know how to say that one. And contrary to my prediction, it looks like they are going to release a Selfish OS phone this year.
It's going to be widely available in the UK and the US?
No. India and Africa, it seems.
They're going down the Firefox OS route. Yeah,
that was kind of seems to be like the last-ditch effort, doesn't it? We can't sell it to rich countries, So let's sell it to the developing world and make it really rubbish and cheap.
Yeah, I mean, you say rubbish. I mean, I suppose it's fairly mid to low end. 1280 720p pixel, sort of 5-inch. It's got a quad core and 2 gig of RAM, so it's somewhere middle-ish. But I mean, it's come from a company called Intex, which I've never heard of. So I guess it probably works for both of those companies, both Intex and Yola, to try and make something together and have a unique sell in these upcoming nations.
Yeah, the thing that grabbed me in this story, to be honest, or one of the things that caught my eye, was the super apps, as they're calling them. And according to the piece in Lilliputian, it says this is going to bring, quote, locally relevant content directly into the smartphone's user interface. And apparently you're going to be able to access this via a swipe from the home screen. And that all sounds very much like Ubuntu Scopes to me.
Well, yeah, but is this Ubuntu Scopes with the ability to use standard Android apps as well? Because that was one of the big selling points of Sailfish.
Well, you would have thought so.
Because I do think that the Scopes is a sort of sensible idea. If I want to listen to music, I don't necessarily want to have to select only music from Google Play or only music from Spotify or only music from my phone. I just want the music that I can access. So having it in one place outside of individual apps does make sense. Or maybe music is a bad example, but news, for example, from a myriad of different places does make sense just to have one news list regardless of where it's come from.
Yeah, it's called my RSS reader.
All right.
It must appeal to someone, otherwise these people wouldn't keep inventing it. I just don't see who it appeals to. Certainly not me.
Oh, it's just terrible that the world isn't designed around you, isn't it, Joe? So carrying on with the mobile phones, and what I can only describe as the worst naming in history. So Cyanogen OS, which is the operating system made by the Cyanogen company onto their bespoke phones, different to CyanogenMod. So Cyanogen have decided to make a way in which app developers can get sort of lower level access to the sort of background things and integration of the software within the phones. So whereas, for example, an application will be entirely isolated, if you open a second one, it won't really be able to read what's going on. The idea here is that you can interweave deeper into the phone. And so this is where Microsoft have been able to integrate Cortana. So in different applications, you can do the Hey Cortana command. And because it runs at sort of a lower level, it can run across applications. The problem with it, though, is that they've called this function mod. So Cyanogen have made this mod, yet they, obviously the one that everyone recognizes, the ROM, is CyanogenMod. How they have selected this name is just beyond me. It just beggars belief.
Well, naming aside, what has occurred to me is that this is all about Microsoft, isn't it? They can dress it up as, hey, anyone can take it and integrate their random application or service deep down into Cyanogen OS. But let's face it, this is all about Cortana and Skype and Microsoft stuff. And I suppose, okay, maybe they're hedging their bets for other companies, but it just seems very clear to me that Microsoft have accepted that Windows Phone is not going to happen and Android is where it is clearly happening. And so they need to back an Android horse. They can't be seen to be doing business with Google directly. So let's pick Cyanogen Inc., this third party, and have very close ties with them. And then we can actually push these Microsoft services into Android phones that will run all of the Android apps as well. But we can actually have a presence in the mobile market.
Yeah, if people are using Microsoft products, then Microsoft wins, regardless of whether they're using them on their own phones, which would obviously be a bigger win. But as long as they're using products and are going into their ecosystem, marketplace, however you want to call it, then Microsoft's getting somewhere.
And you can't really blame Cyanogen. They need to make some money somehow. And I just really hope that the money that they're making from Microsoft can actually go back into CyanogenMod, and that will stay open source or as open source as it's possible to be with Android, and that won't go away. I really am trying to stay positive about all this.
I thought it was interesting. We got some feedback from a listener recently, talking about Replicant and how they'd had a really good experience with that. Have either of you two looked at that recently?
I have not looked for a long time. Last time I looked, there were no devices that I have that I could run it on.
Similar story here. I looked at it a long time ago, and I looked through my bookmarks because I have a folder for Replicant where we must have looked at it previously, or I've sort of messed around myself, but not in a good long time.
Well, let's stay with Microsoft then. And I mean, you're suggesting there that CyanogenMod is a good way for them to push their agenda forward, and it's a good way to get some more competition into the marketplace. From a development point of view, they seem to be going off in a slightly different direction. I mean, back last year, they announced that they were going to provide some projects to help port existing apps over to Windows 10. These included Project Islandwood for porting iOS apps, and there was something called Astoria, which was supposedly going to enable you to bring Android apps straight over to Windows 10.
Yeah, from what I remember of those, the one for iOS required the developers to tweak a little bit and reconfigure the application for it to run nicely, but it would take any Android app as it stood and allow it to run on a Windows phone. So it seemed like a really powerful way to get Android apps and iOS apps running on Windows Phone.
That's right, and I think when we spoke about it back in November, when they announced they were pulling the plug on this initially, that we sort of questioned whether that would stop people developing native apps. And perhaps that was why they decided they weren't going to pursue this avenue anymore. And it appears it's been formally killed, and developers will now have to write portable code in .NET and C#, which will run across all the different platforms.
Which is presumably why Microsoft have bought Xamarin, which is the company who wrote Mono, run by Miguel de Casa, who Stallman is not a big fan of. I think he called him a traitor for wanting to work for Microsoft. But it sort of all slots in with their plan, doesn't it?
And Mono is to .NET what Moonlight is to Silverlight, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. If you think back a few years, there was a huge fuss about this when Mono started being pushed on the scene, on the Linux scene, and there were a fair number of people worrying that it would sort of creep into the ecosystem. And although there were a few apps developed for it, some of which were actually very good, it seems to have died a death and no one really went down that route.
Yeah, as someone who can see the programming world from a complete outsider's perspective, it seems that it's old hat, Mono and .NET, and things have moved on to Node and that kind of thing instead.
Yeah, but that's looking back on, that's like saying it was only a 5-minute thing, but .NET's been around for years and years and years, and time has moved on, correct? But at the same time, when it was at its heyday, it was a really big thing, really big deal. But anyway, should we leave all of the Microsoft and phone stuff behind us and move on? And we talked about it on the last show, and regarding the hacking of the Mint servers and the fact that there was a new ISO was put up, or a forged ISO was put up, which had backdoors in it. Now, since then, Clem and the team have shut all the servers down. They've done some investigating as to where it came from, and on the blog post there's many thanks from people and companies who have assisted them, and they're now back up with a number of changes they've made. So they've moved over to HTTPS for all of their infrastructure, and they're going to more clearly and prominently display the SHA-256 sums and the GPG. And they've also decided that in future releases they're going to bundle GUFW, the uncomplicated firewall front end, to allow users to have a firewall which improves their security. Now, this is all well and good, following on from this problem that we discussed last time, but it's come to light that their forum was hacked a month before that, or possibly even more, because there was a tweet from Peter Vlasblom, I believe, and he said that the forum credentials of all the people that use it have been posted onto a dark web, and that was on the 16th of January, so you'd assume the hack occurred before then. So it's been a bit of a rocky road for Mint at the moment, hasn't it?
It's been an extremely rocky road. And I don't know, am I fickle in not really wanting to use Linux Mint anymore? Should I look beyond this slight hiccup and just get on with it and keep using it because I quite like Cinnamon? Or should I accept that this security breach and, let's face it, fiasco is indicative of a larger problem. And I've seen a lot of people saying that Linux Mint is, well, to paraphrase, a bit of a 2-bit operation, and it's very unprofessional, and it's just a hobbyist distro made by Clem and the team, developers who, I suppose, know just enough to get themselves in trouble.
Well, I've got to disagree somewhat with the fiasco. I mean, their site was hacked, they thought they'd fixed it, and they realised they hadn't, so they took it all down, looked at it carefully, worked out what the problem was, and have tried to do something better than it. Okay, they clearly, no one wants their site to be hacked, no one wants these things to happen, but you have to deal with it. I think fiasco would have been, claiming it didn't happen, or pretending it, putting your head in the sand or something like this, or it getting bigger and bigger. They've had to deal with it. They didn't know it was going to happen. They clearly, hindsight is 2020. They should have had more secure and rigorous checks on the way that they did things. But they've learned from it and have gone back to doing what they're doing with an improvement's been put in place. Is that not the mature way of dealing with this? And also, when you say it's a bit of a hobbyist distro, where do you draw the line between, number 300 on Distro Watch, which is two friends in their house knocking it together, and number 1 or 2? Where is that line? I mean, obviously you would assume that something like Ubuntu and Fedora, where they have huge companies or at least big communities behind them, are they impervious to this, or have they just been lucky enough to be missed off the hackers' target?
Okay, let's start with the fiasco thing, shall we? If you are a distro that is very well known and you have thousands of people downloading your ISO every day, and someone comes along and takes over your server to the point where they can steal your forum database, and you don't notice for a month, that is a fiasco. Okay, it could have been worse. They could have, as those things that you said, they could have denied this, that, and the other, and they could have, once they did realize, they could have dealt with it in a worse way. But from a security point of view, this is a fiasco. So I'll get back to the other points in a second. But Paddy, please agree with me here that fiasco is not too strong a term.
It's the lack of transparency that I found slightly upsetting. I mean, a lot of people have been congratulating Clem on his engagement with the community, and that's true. He's made a lot of comments back when people have asked questions and such like. But from a technical perspective, I've seen very little detail. I mean, apparently this was a WordPress hack, and that has caused a spate of people around the internet to start ragging on WordPress again. Now, let's not forget WordPress actually powers about a quarter of all websites out there, and has actually got quite a decent security rep these days. Now, Clem said that they're running a standard WordPress install without any plugins. Now, in all honesty, I can't believe that they weren't running plugins, because everyone with a WordPress site runs plugins of some description or other. And you just have to look at our logs. I mean, because we do run a WordPress site for our Linux Luddites site. And I look at the attacks that are taking place all the time in our logs, and they are checking over all sorts of different weird and wonderful plugins for vulnerabilities that are known about. But people do use them, and I can't believe that the Mint team weren't using some form of plugins. But the bigger point is there are a lot of WordPress sites out there, and as long as you leave it alone and let it update on time, generally it is pretty secure these days. I know that's not necessarily a popular view, but if it wasn't the case, then an awful lot of the web would be hacked an awful lot of the time, simply because of the number of sites that it's running. So some more transparency on what actually happened would be really good, I think.
And do you think that transparency is needed to allow other people who may be vulnerable to the same problems? Because there's no reason that someone who is hosting, I'm trying to think of a less popular distro, Elementary, for example, might be hosting it in exactly the same way as Linux Mint.
Absolutely, and we're a community that is supposed to be based on openness. And if you've locked yourselves up, as Clem has said they've done now, they've secured themselves, so it's not as if they're going to be opening themselves up to any more problems by sharing these details. They damn well ought to be out there for everyone else to take advantage of, so they can help secure other sites.
So, Joe, you lambasted me for this furore, or whatever your word was.
Fiasco.
What about my second point?
Well, your second point was, how do you differentiate? Where's the line between something that is clearly just one or two people making it and something that is a huge popular distro. Well, I think that compiling your own code is a good place to start, not just taking binaries from another distro and adding a little bit of your own stuff to it and having your own stuff break compatibility with some of the binaries, or at least available binaries on the other distro, so that certain security updates can't happen. I think that's a fairly clear line to me. And okay, as Jonathan Riddle got into with Canonical, this idea of the GPL allows for redistribution of binaries, but it's still not a very professional way to go about making a distro, is it? And I am, a fan of some distros who do that, but at the same time, I think that is the line that you're talking about. Ubuntu don't just take Debian binaries and then just redistribute them. They take the code and recompile it. And I think that really is the line that we're talking about. But the question is it a bad thing to do that? Should you take full advantage of the fact that it's free software and you can take these binaries and add some other stuff and make your own distro? I honestly don't know the answer to that question. But in terms of professionalism, at least, that is the big difference.
Right, yeah. That's a fair line. I was thinking about the way they were backed or funded. But if you're drawing that as the comparison, I see where you're coming from. My issue really is that while having non-MD5 sums, i.e. moving up to SHA-256, and having them more prominently on the download page, that is never going to solve the problem, I don't think. Even if you make it really, really obvious and say you really should check this once you've downloaded it, most people probably won't. So I think we're still going to live with this problem. And as Linux becomes more popular, while the operating system itself is more secure than Windows once it's installed, it is still vulnerable to all of these other ways that you can maliciously attack it. And on the blog post, Clem talks about what if a repository or a PPA is hacked and starts installing stuff that you have approved because you think it's the correct place to be downloading it from. There are other ways into the system that hackers are going to start exploiting.
Okay, well, let me put this question to you. I know this is irrelevant to you, Paddy, because you're kind of Ubuntu through and through. But Jesse, when you first joined the show, were pretty, dyed-in-the-wool Linux Mint Cinnamon user. Since doing the show, you've experimented with various systems. You even run Unity for far longer than you should have. Supposing I were to give you one of my cast-off laptops, what would you install on it?
Assuming it's, packing a punch for not having to worry about what desktop environment to install on it.
Yeah. So say it's an i3 machine, nothing too fancy, but solid.
Yeah. One of your many. It would, at the moment, I'm quite into GNOME, the GNOME 3 desktop, and I'm not saying that I'm solidly switched over to it, but because Mint doesn't have a GNOME version, then it's not really an option for me anymore, which I know isn't really answering the question from the point of view of what we've been discussing, but it does show your other point that while I've enjoyed the Cinnamon desktop, I actually quite like the simplicity and the layout and the look of GNOME, and I've sort of got used to it. When it first came out, I thought it was awful. They've ironed out a lot of issues and bugs, and it's improved a lot. So irrespective of this, I probably wouldn't run Mint on that laptop you gave me.
What a cop-out of an answer that was.
Yeah, and we probably need to add the email address is auditions@linuxluddites.com.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, send your demos so we can kick Jesse off GNOME and Unity. What's wrong with you, man? But I don't know is the answer. I am waiting for the 1604 version of Ubuntu to come out, and that's when I will make a decision as to whether I'm going to upgrade my machines to that. I had been seriously thinking about moving to Linux Mint Cinnamon. After this, I'm seriously thinking about staying with Ubuntu. thankfully, I've got the time with the 1404 LTS to make a decision. But I think ultimately, unless 1604 is a real disaster for Ubuntu, then I'll probably stick with that.
And when you do install 1604, Joe, what file system are you going to use on that?
Well, ZFS, surely. That's the only sane choice on Ubuntu 1604, because it definitely isn't going to get Canonical into any legal trouble.
Yes, entirely uncontentious.
Yeah, we've talked about this before, and obviously it's about the license compatibility or incompatibility issues between the GPL and the CDDL. I'm going to have to refer to my notes for this one, gents, because I want to get it right.
Yeah, go on, enthrall us, Paddy. Enthrall us with this really interesting licensing-based news.
All right. If you remember, Canonical kicked all this off by saying they were going to roll ZFS into the 1604 release, and that their lawyers thought that this was okay because neither the Linux kernel nor the ZFS kernel module could be seen as derivative works of each other. And pretty rapidly, the Software Freedom Conservancy pitched in and, not surprisingly, disagreed. And they said that whether or not ZFS was statically or dynamically linked, it should be considered a derivative work of the kernel. Now, I think an interesting point here is that the apparent license incompatibility isn't at the binary level at all. I mean, the CDDL quite happily allows actual running code to be distributed under other licenses, but rather it's at the source code level, and that's because both the GPL and the CDDL require source code to be available, and both require that source is redistributed without any further restrictions. So what we're really talking about here is how two so-called copyleft licenses actually conspire against each other. They're each enforcing the source code distribution aspect of the copyleft really vigorously.
So you've got two different licenses that basically say the same thing but aren't compatible. That doesn't make logical sense.
Yeah, the incompatibility comes from the fact that they both require the downstream release to use the license, everything in their license. So everything that gets released following GPL v2 must be released as GPL v2, whereas the CDDL has the same requirements. So obviously you can't combine them and meet both of their requirements because you're going to have to release it as one, and whichever license you release it under, it won't comply with the non-released licenses requirements. I could have said that better, but that's how it is.
Yeah, and only at the source code level. We're talking about the source code tree here. From a binary point of view, it's absolutely fine to combine these things.
So what's the long and the short of this then? Are Ubuntu going to get away with it or not?
Well, the Software Freedom Law Centre then sort of put out their take on things as well. And it was a really long post by Eben Upton and Misha Chowdhury. I think it's very interesting, though, and well worth a read. And amongst some of the points they made were that even if it turned out that Canonical were infringing, but then stopped doing so, they would only expect them to be subject to, at worst, a claim for nominal damages. As far as the Software Freedom Law Centre were concerned, no irreparable financial harm would be shown to be caused.
So, yes, they are going to get away with it. Because the reason I ask this is, if Canonical puts out Ubuntu with ZFS, then as a desktop user, that doesn't really make much difference. But on the server side of things, that is a massive deal. That is going to seriously attract people away from Red Hat, isn't it? If you are a sysadmin looking to deploy a whole bunch of servers and you've got an option to have Linux, a well-supported Linux at that, and it's got ZFS, then surely that is going to tip some people towards that. And it is definitely in Canonical's financial interests to do this. Whereas Red Hat, who, I don't know, have they got more to lose? I suppose they are not doing this yet. But if Canonical does it and gets away with it, then Red Hat will do it. And then everyone else will follow suit, SUSE and everyone else.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what's happening. And another important point I think that the Software Freedom Law Centre raised was that if enforcement action isn't taken swiftly, they view that any action in the future would likely to be impractical, because if Canonical continue to distribute ZFS in this manner unchallenged, then that would effectively show tacit acceptance by the copyright holders of what they're doing. And the Software Freedom Law Centre were arguing that the principle of equity will come to bear, where it's the spirit of the license rather than strict wording that will apply. So I think it's really interesting how this is going to move forwards. And just for completeness, the FSF have yet to come out and actually make any sort of pronouncement on the subject other than the fact they're thinking about it and will let us know in due course. But, I mean, the issue of any sort of legal action, I think is really problematic for the Software Freedom Conservancy. I mean, as I've said, the Software Freedom Law Centre have argued that if such action doesn't occur, then action in the future is unlikely to be successful. Now, I know the Software Freedom Conservancy don't hold that view, but it seems a perfectly reasonable view, and Eben generally knows what he's talking about. But if they do take action, then it's going to be against a company that is a huge standard bearer for Linux, and it could really turn a lot of people off the use of GPL going forwards.
And ultimately, the easy get out would be for Oracle to move from the CDDL over to a GPL license with ZFS, and everyone would be home and dry. I just found it interesting that aside from all of this, Debian have bundled is the wrong word, but you can get ZFS on Debian, but that's because they've put the code, the source code, in a separate archive, which is there if you want it, but not actually bundled in the binary. So that's an option, but obviously Ubuntu want you to be able to install straight onto ZFS as soon as you're up and running. But I think it'll be interesting to see where this goes and see what the outcome is, and hopefully the community doesn't tear itself apart like you're describing there, Paddy.
It's funny that you say they just need to GPL ZFS. No, they need to put it under permissive license, so then all the problems go away.
Yeah, I've got to admit it made me laugh. Whilst all of this was going on, the FreeBSD Foundation took out a blog post talking about their long-standing relationship, obviously, with ZFS and how wonderful it all was. And it didn't explicitly say that they were free to include it because they have a more free license than the GPL, but that was clearly the implication.
More free than the GPL? No, that can't be possible, Paddy. That can't possibly be possible. Anyway, let's move on from this really exciting license-based news and talk about some pretty bad news, and that is that Beep Beep Yar failed to reach its funding goal. And I spoke to Graham Morrison of Linux Voice about this on the show, and the last thing I said was, I'm sure it'll happen, and my prediction did not come true, unfortunately. And there was some demand. I mean, it got 16,500 and something of 20,000 that they wanted, so it was getting there, but it just didn't quite do it. And I saw a Reddit thread about it, and there was some pretty harsh criticism of the price that they were trying to charge. They thought that was too much. And people were saying that if you're going to write a book, don't get paid to write it first. But I think the circumstances here are that they simply don't have time to write a book because they've got a magazine to write. So it's a very tricky one, and it's a shame because it seemed like quite a good project. I mean, it's not something that was relevant to me because I've got no kids, but I saw a lot of very enthusiastic people talking about it, but apparently not enough.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate, and especially as it got so close and it just didn't quite make it. And maybe they can think of another way of funding this, because I like the idea that it was subliminally always has negative connotations when you talk about children, but it was the idea that it would just feed in and plant the seeds of how to program and the fundamentals of do loops and things like this. It seemed like a great idea, but like you say, a lot of people's criticism was the cost of it. But I suppose if you are going for what is a niche-ish market, I mean, I know that obviously there's a lot of parents, but the number of parents who have children that they want to get into coding and are in the group of people who would have heard about this, because I think that's one of the problems with Kickstarters and Indiegogos is getting them heard about by the people who would be likely to fund you. I mean, maybe they need to change their track and see if the BBC or maybe a sort of school funding, a governmental pot of funding for school improvements would allow them to see this dream.
Yeah, maybe something like Code Club could get involved with them and produce something together. I don't think it's the last we've heard of this anyway. I get the feeling we'll see it in some shape or form in the future.
We were talking about the BBC there. Of course, for people outside of the UK who may not know this, that is actually taxpayer funded. And in this lovely island of ours, every time you go and purchase a television set from a shop, you have to give them your name and address, and you get added to their register. And you get sent a bill for £145 every year if you've got a colour licence, which I have and have just paid for. Now, the UK Culture Secretary, who's a guy called John Whittingdale, doesn't think that this particular model works very well in the sort of on-demand world we've now entered. And he's promised fairly swift legislation to require all viewers of BBC content, whether on a traditional TV set or online, to somehow pay for the service.
Yeah, it used to be a situation where if you viewed on-demand content, you didn't have to pay the TV tax or license, as its Orwellian name is. But if you watched live streaming content, then you did have to have a TV license. Whereas now they're making it so that you just, even on-demand stuff, you have to pay, which I'm not hugely happy about, given that I don't own a television.
But you do watch iPlayer stuff, don't you?
Very much so, yes. I don't know, does it count if you use Get iPlayer? How can they possibly enforce it either? Given that they can't come in, if they turn up, here's a pro tip for you. If they turn up and say, we want to come in and check whether you've got a TV or not, and that'll be whether you've got a TV or a laptop, you can just say to them, no thanks, I don't want you to come in, go away please, and close the door. And unless they get a court order, they can't come in and enforce that. If you invite them in, on the other hand, then all bets are off. So don't invite them in, is my pro tip.
But while I see that it's going to be difficult to enforce, and just the license fee alone must be difficult to enforce, because unless, like you say, unless they come in and look and see you've got a TV, how do they know? I can't disagree with this. I mean, the content on the BBC, obviously being massively patriotic, is some of the best content there is. That's why iPlayer is so popular. Everyone talks about Doctor Who. The fact that it's rubbish is neither here nor there. But everyone talks about Doctor Who across the world and other podcasts and stuff, and the nature programs and all the programs they do. I absolutely love it. And so I'm more than happy that this tax, as you say, Joe, is worth the money. So I agree that in the modern era, where the way that people are consuming the content is changing, and you don't need a TV anymore. You know, when the license fee was written, or the legislation for it was written, there was no such thing as downloadable content. You had to have a TV and an aerial. But now that it's changed, the way that it's funded has to change to include people who are downloading only the iPlayer content, so that it all gets funded. I mean, if everyone moved over to iPlayer and didn't have a TV, there would be no BBC. So it makes sense to me.
Unless they put adverts on.
So I love the fact that there are no adverts on the BBC. That's worth the £12 a month.
But what if they put adverts on there and then you let all the people who are technologically illiterate watch those adverts while you blocked them and never had to see any?
Are we just going to insert our little piece from a previous show about ad blockers in here and then go and get a cup of tea?
Yeah, let's do that.
So he does actually go on to talk about ad blockers and discusses the fact that they're going to cripple the internet because all the people who are making content and having adverts blocked are no longer, getting the revenue they require. So it's interesting that he actually sort of goes on to look at it and thinks about the bigger picture, as you mentioned, Joe.
Yeah, but don't worry. He says that he doesn't think that ad blockers should be banned. Oh, thank goodness for that. Thank goodness that the government aren't going to ban ad blockers, because that is so practical and so attainable and so realistic. So thank goodness that they're not going to do that.
This did actually get a fair bit of press in the UK. And when I say press, I mean Dead Tree Press. People like The Guardian made a big fuss about this. And obviously these institutions are funded largely by advertising. So you understand why they're making a big song and dance about it. But I guess it kind of folds back to the story about BPPR a little bit. And I was wondering, we're so used to free content, free in air quotes, because we do pay for everything via advertising currently online, whether we just don't value how much things cost to make anymore. And things like the BPR book, there's a real world cost there involved in producing a real world good. And electronic goods, electronic media, we're simply used to having for free, and therefore don't value the amount of money it costs to produce them in the first place.
Well, that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is, if there was no money to be made from any sort of content, which we're basically heading towards anyway, or if there was very little money to be made, then the kind of people who would invest the time, because that's basically what we're talking about. There's an equipment cost, but that is relatively small compared to the labor cost. as in so many areas of life. So we're talking about people investing time to make content. And if there was no money to be made, then it would be only the people who really wanted to make content who would make it, rather than production companies who are making things that they think people will like rubbish like the X Factor and that kind of thing. So if it was just smaller, independent groups of people making content and possibly making a little bit in donations or maybe a little bit in advertising, then I think that ultimately we'd probably be better off. I mean, okay, I'd miss some of the real quality BBC content, but that would be replaced by independent media that was made by people who actually cared what they were doing and did it as a passion project rather than just to pay the bills.
No way. There is no way wouldn't it be nice to make a documentary could afford the number of locations and time and resources that, for example, the BBC Natural History Department puts into producing things like The Natural World and David Attenborough and the Solar System, things like that. The cost and the locations they go to, they're astronomical. You could never do it if you're doing it out of donations and wouldn't it be nice if someone sponsored me a bit of money? I mean, yes, things like this podcast, things like maybe music, where you're right, the infrastructure and the equipment is not that expensive. But when you're trying to compete with things like House of Cards, or even if it was just Mock the Week, which is a panel show on Channel 4, I think, it's got to have a studio, it's got to have very expensive HD cameras, you've got to have excellent recording. You know, the number of people behind the scenes involved in what is just 5 people sitting, asking and answering questions, it just can't be done without big infrastructure and serious amounts of money, which is where big adverts come in.
Where's your can-do attitude, Jesse? Come on. Where there's a will, there's a way. It might not be the same, but it could be better, or it could be as good. Who knows?
I suppose I see what you mean, Joe. I'm thinking about a couple of shows on YouTube that, you know, they don't have a big budget, but they make do. But I still feel that you need big production costs to make some of the really impressive shows that we enjoy.
Well, this is a bit of a moot point anyway, because the BBC won't exist in, I don't know, 5 or 10 years anyway, once the Tories sell it off. And there might be something that's a little bit like the BBC, but we will definitely have adverts on it, I reckon. So let's move on anyway and talk about ARM processors. And ARM has announced the Cortex-A32, which is an Internet of Things and embedded processor.
Yeah, the expectations are this is going to be an immensely popular device. I mean, fundamentally, we're talking about an A35 here with all the 64-bit features chopped off. So as you suggested, it'd be immensely popular for Internet of Things and embedded devices going forwards, I should think. And something else that probably will be, if any of them actually ship ever, is the Pi Zero. And we've sort of alluded to the supply issues in the past, but that hasn't stopped people coming out with add-ons for it.
Yeah, one of the really big sort of pitches for the Pi Zero is that it could be used for robotics and things, because it's got incredibly small, incredibly low power. And someone's come out with a little add-on board that allows you to control 4 motors, and therefore you can have either 4 wheels or fronts and backs, plus other bits on the robot or the car, whatever you want. And you can actually stack these up to have, I think, 3 on as well as the Pi Zero. So you can have 3x4, you can have 12 motors controlling various bits and bobs on a robot.
Yeah, and this is Zero Borg, and they're doing a Kickstarter at the moment, and there's almost a month to go still on it, and they've shot past their goal. They only wanted £1,700 to actually start building these things. So as per the Kickstarter we mentioned on the last show, this is a pucker endeavour. It's not one of those dodgy ones we occasionally bring up. And it does look to be a very cost-effective way to get involved in robotics if that's what you're interested in.
Yeah, given the low cost of the Pi Zero, it's a very good start, yeah. So that's it for the main news, but there's one topic that we haven't mentioned yet, and that's the Raspberry Pi 3. As some of you have may heard on the Pi podcast, the Wednesday before the Raspberry Pi 3 was released, I went up to Pi Towers, as they call it, the offices of the Raspberry Pi Foundation, I went there with Albert from the Pi podcast, and we had a great time. The office is absolutely amazing. It's really relaxed and just such a great atmosphere in there. It was fairly empty the day we went there because a lot of the people were in America doing the Pi Academy stuff there. But I got a couple of interviews, one with Eben Upton, which we put out as the last Pi podcast, and one with Liz Upton, who is the kind of main, I hate to use the word PR, but PR person for the Pi Foundation. So that's coming up soon anyway. But I was lucky to be given in advance a Raspberry Pi 3, and I've been playing with it for the last week or so.
Now, I understand that very few listeners wouldn't listen to the Pi podcast, but if you haven't, and potentially haven't seen the news about it, the big release, or the big features that are new on it, is built-in Wi-Fi and built-in Bluetooth. So connectivity has suddenly got a lot better with the Raspberry Pi.
Yeah, and it's got an ARM V8 64-bit capable processor that is significantly faster than the Pi 2, although they're not planning to take advantage of the 64-bit architecture fully because it's only got 1 gig of RAM still, so there's not a huge amount of point there. But we've got basically a significantly faster Pi that's the same form factor and has this connectivity. They don't say Wi-Fi because I think you need to pay and stuff to have that, so they call it wireless LAN or something. But yeah, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, pretty big deal, at least in theory.
And it's all at the same $35, isn't it? So it's the same price as the Raspberry Pi 2.
Yeah. Which you'd be a bit foolish maybe to buy a 2 at this point for the same price. I'm sure that it will drop in price fairly soon. I remember when the 2 came out, it was the same price as the 1. And then after a while, the price of the 1 dropped. And that's something that I took away from speaking to Eben about it, is that they're not going to add features to make it a really amazing computer that's going to compete with an x86 machine and bump the price up. What they're going to do is keep the price at $35, and it's $35 even though it's a UK company because they buy all their components in dollars. So it's that's why it's $35, and that's going to stay the same. And as components become cheaper and as features become cheaper, they'll try and add them to future versions of the Pi, but keep it at that same price, which I think is what makes it what it is, really. It's got to be that cheap price because you can get alternatives that have got various features and onboard storage and more RAM, but then the price creeps up and it becomes a bit of a pointless, well, not pointless, but it becomes a different beast entirely. The point of the Pi is it's dirt cheap and almost disposable.
So you mentioned it's got Wi-Fi and Bluetooth now, and also a faster processor. And a couple of things that jumped out at me for some performance testing I looked at was you clearly need a very good power supply for this. And if you had one that was slightly ropey previously, it just won't cut it now because of the extra power draw. And also that the CPU is causing everything else to run really, really warm now.
Well, the power situation, I haven't noticed. I just use my 1+1 charger, which claims to be rated at, I think, 2.1 amps. And although the Foundation have recommended, I think, 2.4 or 2.5, I've not had any issues at all. I mean, I use a very short, low resistance cable, so that might factor into it, but I've had no problems at all. And I did see one power comparison that said it didn't use a huge amount more, and essentially you should be all right. And I haven't noticed it getting hot, but then I haven't really been touching it. So I don't know about that one.
I'm sure we'll get onto the benchmarks and things, but I just wanted to ask one thing, which may be entirely minor. The SD card holder, am I right in saying that it's no longer a push-to-click?
Yes, that's something I forgot to mention on the Pi podcast. You haven't seen a Zero, have you?
No.
Okay, well, you remember the very first Pi before you had the clicky SD card slot where you just push it in and then pull it out? Well, it's the same deal with this. It doesn't sit flush with the Pi anymore, which for me, because of those cheap plastic cases that I have, it's really annoying to try and get your fingernail in there with the Pi 2. Whereas now it's just like it was on the very first Pi. You push it in, it hangs out a little bit, and there's no clicking mechanism, which I can only assume they've done for cost reasons. It must be cheaper, surely, to have that mechanism well, I suppose it's not really a mechanism, is it? It's a lack of mechanism as opposed to the clicky one.
Okay, that clears up. And so actually using it, how is it for sort of day-to-day use as a desktop, and what desktops are available?
Well, Raspbian, of course, is available for it, and you can take your SD card and put it in all of the Pis and it will boot and it will run, which is very impressive. And also there's Ubuntu Mate, because while I was up there, I put in a good word for WinPress, and the next day they sent him one. Coincidence? Who knows? But he had a few days, well, he had the weekend anyway to prepare, and he had an image out available on the Monday that it was released, albeit without Bluetooth, which I didn't have until release day, because they did give me some binaries to make the Wi-Fi work, but not the Bluetooth. So I haven't had a huge amount of time to test the Bluetooth on it. But in terms of performance, it's definitely better. I mean, there's just no two ways about it. Whether it has crossed this magical threshold to be a usable desktop, I suppose depends on your patience level and what kind of machines you're used to using. If you've got an old P4 running some sort of open box or something, then maybe it would be similar. But I've got reasonable machines, i3, i5, that sort of thing. Not hugely modern, but still decent. And there is a massive gulf still. I mean, clearly it's a $35, you're looking at about, 30 quid or something in the UK. It's not fair to compare it to a desktop machine or a laptop machine that's got an x86 processor, simply because of cost. But compared to the last Pi, it is faster. I mean, it feels 50 to 60% faster, which is what they claim it is, and what my benchmarks actually proved that it was in hard info. And I made a video, which was not brilliant quality video, but hopefully I made up for it with the audio. But you can see I did things like booting and opening various applications on the two of them, and it is definitely faster. But when it comes to actually being a desktop replacement, I don't know. I mean, Paddy, you've presumably read a fair bit about this and watched some videos. You had hoped that the 2 was going to be good enough to be a desktop machine, a viable desktop. Do you think the 3 is going to cut the mustard here?
I'm not sure whether any device in this form factor is going to be a viable desktop replacement at all, to be honest. I mean, it's great for people who want to poke and prod and attach things to devices like this, but people don't want that as their desktop. And I mean, we kind of go back to the conversation about convergence and having to carry many cables about. I mean, this is even one step up from that, isn't it? Because with a phone, at least you've got a screen attached and some sort of input device. So it's the actual form factor I'm not convinced about as being a selling point as a desktop replacement. But that kind of goes back to what I was talking about with the core temperatures, because it's the use cases I was curious about. I mean, on Pi Moroni, they're suggesting that the Pi 2 used to run up to about 52 degrees, whereas the Pi 3 gets up to 75 degrees when it's going full throttle. And I was thinking back to OggCamp last year when Jesse had one of these things in a Tupperware box sat at the top of the stairs just taking pictures. Now, obviously, if you're doing that, it's not going to be running at full whack. But I would have thought 75 degrees, you're going to struggle if you're doing something really intensive in a small space. And that was kind of where I was hinting at the temperature aspect of things.
Yeah, so that actually leads on to my issue with the setup they have at the moment, because where the Raspberry Pi 2 was, and I have one of those, so I understand the speed that you can use it for a desktop, and it was good, but you certainly would have been quite frustrated having come from a main PC. If the Pi 3 is in a position where it's almost desktopable, then that might well sit behind someone's TV with like a Wi-Fi keyboard and Bluetooth mouse or whatever it might be. And I think the point about moving it around, taking it to people's houses, that's unlikely. I think it's more that people would like it to be a hidden, silent, low power, always on desktop when you want to switch to it. But like you say, Paddy, it's no longer actually that, maybe no longer that useful as a embedded system where you've got in a small case, or lots and lots of other components around it, or poor airflow or something like this, where it's packed into a box or a bird feeder or something or other. You may actually start to find problems with overheating, and that amount of raw grunt isn't really needed. So that's where the Raspberry Pi Zero comes in. And I think they need to have a clear, in my view, Raspberry Pi should have two main avenues, one of which is the, let's call it all singing, all dancing, $35, as much as you can possibly get raw horsepower for that money. But then also one which has the absolute minimum battery or power requirements so that you can leave it outside for as long as possible. You can have a robot moving around the floor for as long as possible. But you obviously would have entirely different setups and chips and things for that. So that's where I think the Raspberry Pi needs to have the two sides. One, driving towards more of a desktop for as much as you can get for $35, and one just trying to live or last as long as possible so that you can use it in wall connected situations so your battery lasts as long as possible. I mean, that's what I'd like to see.
Well, we've already got that. You've got the A+, which is ideal for those scenarios you were talking about there, those uses. And then now you've got the 3B. So I don't know what you're on about. We've already got it.
Yeah, those are absolutely. I know what you mean, but my fear is that things will drop off out of. I mean, they can't be making all of these different Raspberry Pis all of the time. Things will have to be taken off the production line as they get improved upon, in air quotes. Because what if you don't want the all singing, all dancing one? You want one that's smaller or more simple or a lower profile or what have you.
Well, they say that they're going to keep making all of them. And it's just supply and demand, isn't it? As long as people keep buying them, they'll keep making them. So that remains to be seen. I think they will. I think there'll be enough of a use case for them to make them, especially in industrial applications and embedded systems.
Well, that's fine then. So, I mean, yeah, the A+ is the one that I think has the most use for embedded systems and robots and, in my case, time-lapse cameras and things.
And we are going to get a 3A as well, they've said. So it's going to have the faster processor and it's going to have Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, but it is going to be smaller form factor and hopefully use less power. But if it has got the same processor, then you might have those temperature issues. But hopefully that can be sorted out with software. And for me, that is something that they need to work on. It feels a bit rough and ready at the moment. Bluetooth in Linux is terrible. It's really terrible. I've got a mini Bluetooth keyboard and touchpad. I think the same one you've got, Jesse. And it pretty much doesn't work in Linux hardly at all. Whereas I've got an ancient MacBook Pro with a really old version of OS X, and I connected it to that just to test it. And it works absolutely flawlessly. You can disconnect and reconnect and restart and everything, and it just works perfectly. So there's that's a bit ropey on Raspbian at the moment with the Pi 3, and Ubuntu Mate hasn't got Bluetooth, but these things are going to get ironed out, I think, in the future, and over the next few months you're going to have new versions and updates and stuff. So I hope that functionality is going to get better and better. But it's funny that my real takeaway from visiting the foundation, well, I'll put it this way, I looked around the office and it was a sea of Windows machines. There were a couple of Macs, and I think I spotted 2 Ubuntu machines out of a whole office that was reasonably sized. And I said to Eben, so you don't have much Linux here then? You're just mostly a Windows shop? And he said, well, we're not a dog food company. We use whatever is the best for the job, and they see that as mostly Windows. It seems that you have the freedom if you work there to choose whatever you want, and most people have chosen Windows. And so my takeaway from it was that they don't really care. That care is not the word, but let's just go with that for a second. They don't care about Linux, about software freedom, and about hobbyist tinkerers. That's grossly unfair to say that they don't care, because they do to some extent. But what they really care about is their remit, and that is education. They care about putting these mini computers in the hands of as many kids as possible and teaching them about computers and coding. And for them, whether that machine runs Windows or Linux seems immaterial. The fact that it runs Linux is because that is the best operating system for that machine. And if it needs a few binaries and they're proprietary to run, then they don't really care. They're purely pragmatic. And the whole reason we're talking about this is because the hobbyist Linux angle. And I think that is just a happy byproduct of the fact that they wanted to make some machines to teach kids about computers. On to the feedback then. And first of all, a huge thanks to our new monthly supporters, Martin M. Pedersen, and C. Barnett. Oh, you mysterious C. Barnett with your initial rather than name. But yeah, thanks a lot, guys. Very much appreciated. And of course, to our existing monthly supporters, help keep the lights on and all that kind of stuff. And we haven't mentioned it for a while, but we have got a DigitalOcean affiliate link. We're not sponsored by them or anything, but you can help us out by using their service. And so if you go to linuxluddites.com/DigitalOcean and then sign up, you can get a couple of months for free. And if it works out and you stay using them, then eventually we'll get a little bit of money for that. And it's not going to cost you any more, and you actually get a bit for free. So do check them out. We run our server with them, and I run my server with them. And I've never had any problems, except for when I did a bit of resizing and I did it totally wrong and didn't do any backups. And I thought I was going to have to build my server from scratch at midnight. But their support was absolutely amazing. And within about half an hour, my server was back up and running exactly as it was. So the support's great, even though it's one of the more affordable hosting providers out there. I mean, is there anyone who charges less, Paddy? I don't think so.
I don't think so. It provides the same sort of functionality anyway. I mean, they've got things like floating IPs, so you can do failover situations quite nicely now. And, I mean, it can be a little slow listening to their users, but they do catch on eventually. I mean, storage has always been a big issue with DigitalOcean. You had these sort of set tiers for quite a while now, where if you want to upscale on processor or RAM or storage, you had to do so, and you got increases in each as you went along. But sometimes you'd only want, say, extra storage, and that's always been awkward, because if you added on external storage on another device, you're still paying the bandwidth cost associated with transfer between that and your box. But they're actually rolling out at the moment a beta for additional block storage, so it's a feature that's been asked for quite a long time, and they're picking up on it. So, yeah, I've got nothing but good things to say about them. They've been enormously responsive. It's a very cost-effective service, and it just works really well.
Yeah, if you're looking for a virtual private server to host a website, or even just to play around with and check out OwnCloud and that kind of thing, then you could do a lot worse than DigitalOcean. So linuxluddites.com/DigitalOcean. And so if you want to get in contact with us, you can either email show@linuxluddites.com, or you can find us on Twitter. We're at Linux Luddites, or we've got a Facebook and Google Plus group that we link to on the website. And we've got a YouTube channel, which I uploaded a few shows to, where it would just be a static image and then the audio. But Paddy, you've been getting on this. You've been using scripts to automate the process.
Yeah, we didn't think anyone was particularly interested in it, but had some feedback from a couple of listeners who were. So I've put on all our back catalogue from show 50 onwards up on YouTube, and I'll keep it updated going forwards. As you said, Joe, I've got it all scripted now, so it involves very little effort on my part to do that. I mean, if you find it useful, more power to your elbow, and have us playing in the background while you're trying to do some work.
A few people got in touch this time round with various comments, but they were mostly about news stories that we were going to cover anyway, so we're not including that feedback. And I suppose the lack of other feedback suggests that everyone agrees with everything we say, and so we should just keep doing it.
Yeah, we need to keep it exactly how it is, because everyone agrees. The only other thing that I think we should bring to the listeners' attention is regarding OggCamp. And we, the three of us, have been for the last 2 years. I know you, Joe, have been a number of years before that as well. And there's obviously a bunch of key people who keep it running and organise it and get the venues and all the other many things that are required to get an event of that size up and running. Now, through various personal issues and health and exhaustion, unfortunately, a number of those people in those key positions have decided that the last one was going to be the final one they were going to do for the foreseeable. And so with this sort of void in the middle of the linchpins, if you will, a call out has been made to see if anyone will step up and help to organise this year's one. Now, it's a sort of a little bit close to the wire because of the time and how long it would take to organise these things. But they're looking for someone who's potentially had some experience with organising other events, perhaps Raspberry Jams, perhaps some other sort of open source conference or closed source conference, but wants to help the community out here. So go over to ogcamp.org and there's a blog post on there about how you can get in touch and how they can help you. Obviously, it won't be a blank slate. They'll be there to assist in the handover and explain the way it works and what they should be doing. But it's just something that the current group of people who are in that core, as I say, for the various reasons, just had to call it a day for this year.
Yeah, I really hope that someone steps up and takes charge and is willing to take on that responsibility of organising it, because OggCamp's been going for a long time now, and it would be a real shame if we didn't have one this year. But if it doesn't happen this year, I'm sure that people will miss it terribly and someone will step up for next year. But here's hoping in the meantime that we actually will get an OggCamp 16. Just over a week ago, TinyCore 7 was released. Now, TinyCore is notorious for being the smallest Linux distro going, as Jesse alluded to in his intro when he talked about the smallest Apple in the world that he had looked up specifically for that. A kind of successor to Damn Small Linux, which was about 50-ish megabytes. TinyCore, well, it used to be, I've got this figure of 10 megabytes in my head, but there are a few different spins of it, aren't there? From the command line only to a kind of minimal desktop to a desktop with a few applications, enough to kind of get you going with Wi-Fi and that kind of thing. And they range from about 11 to about 100 megabytes. So I didn't really check out the headless one. I was more interested in the desktop. And I was very impressed with how much you get in terms of functionality for such a small size.
Functionality, yes. I'll accept that. The mouse moves around. There's a desktop. Yes, really, really functional. Actually, I mean, of course it's that small. 16 meg is the one you're talking about. TinyCore, the middle of the three, if you will. But you get nothing else. I mean, there's a shell, of course, and this dock along the bottom, but there is so little installed, it's incredible. And of course, it needs to be that way to make it that small.
Yeah, but even at 100-ish for Core Plus, that is still very, very small for a Linux distro.
You have to remember these are squashed up file systems, though, so that might be the size on disk, but the size in RAM is considerably larger.
Okay, yeah, but compared to Crunchbang, how that used to be, or Ubuntu, it is still seriously small, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't think Ubuntu is a fair comparison. I mean, if you're thinking about these sort of distros, then maybe SLITAZ as a good comparison, which isn't vastly different size-wise when you add in all the extra features like Wi-Fi and non-US keyboards, which you only get with one of the larger size versions of TinyCore. Well, as you mentioned, Joe, it had its genesis in Damn Small Linux, which Robert Shingledecker, who's the originator of TinyCore, used to work on, and then there was some sort of falling out. And I read an interview with Shingledecker where he was suggesting that he'd seen a presentation and read some notes of a friend of the show, Rob Landley, about BusyBox and making very small distributions. And that's really what he took his inspiration from.
I remember Shingledecker from Linux Outlaws. Dan had always called him Robert Shingledecker.
Has to be done, doesn't it?
So, Sean Connery accents aside, the sort of one of the big points about TinyCore is that it runs straight into RAM. So, to get started, it's a case of downloading the image, DDing onto a stick, and then putting the stick in and selecting it. So, because it's sort of its raison d'etre, if you will, is to be running in RAM, and you can then use the USB stick, which it's booted off of, as persistent storage. That's how I used it. So I didn't install it as such onto the PC. I just looked at it that way. And then once, to prove it worked, unplugged the USB stick and carried on using it. But then any changes you make are obviously lost. Now, in the documentation, there's a lot of carefully worded descriptions about Wi-Fi and difficulties. So I only used a hardwired connection. I didn't go down the route of trying to get my head around the Wi-Fi. Did you guys have a look at that, or did you stick with the tried and tested cable?
Well, I tried Core Plus, which is the bigger version with Wi-Fi support and multiple keyboards and more applications. And I have to say that I had no problems whatsoever with Wi-Fi. On a couple of laptops that I tried it on, it was just absolutely fine. Connected, no problem, and just worked perfectly.
Yeah, I didn't have any issues either.
Yeah, so booting up is fairly easy, and it is fast to load. It runs on the FLWM, and I have to admit, apart from Window Manager, I can't remember the other two letters.
Fast Light Window Manager.
Thank you very much. And so it boots into that, and you've got a very simple dock at the bottom, which I think is the Cairo dock.
Nope. It's W bar.
The W bar, okay. I'm not doing very well this time. And within that dock, it's got an exit program, so it just pops up and allows you to shut down and restart and things. A simple text editor, the control panel, which is a very minimalist control panel. I think I should get it out there now that obviously this is a very small distribution, and therefore everything is very minimal, very stripped back, functional, let's call it. Apps, which we're going to have to get back to talk about. That's where you install software. A simple run program dialog, a mount tool, because the way that it runs in RAM, it is important to know what you can mount and therefore write to and read from, and maybe have persistence and things like this. So whereas normally you're installing or you're booting off of a internal hard drive, obviously that's the mount point, that's where all the documents get saved. But where it's in RAM and it has funny things going on with USB pens, that's quite an important feature of this distribution. It then has a terminal, and then after that, anything you install or which you've installed and is on the persistent section of the drive carries on adding on. So as I said, the main application of those is the one called apps, and that's where you get to install things.
Yeah, you said distribution a couple of times there, and I don't know whether you want to leave this till later on, but I'd slightly take exception with that, because I'm not sure that this should be considered a distribution out of the box, or more of a toolkit to put a distribution together with. Yeah,
I see your point. I guess because it's so minimalistic, it is just the bare bones upon which you can put the flesh. And that is, again, where this app installer comes from. But is there really that much flesh you can get on these bones? It's independent of all other Linux installs, so it actually doesn't have that many things that you can add.
Well, I managed to add Firefox and Chromium, no problem. And so you can get an extremely lightweight kiosk, I suppose, to access the web. And that's enough for a lot of people. All you need is a decent web browser, and Firefox and Chromium. Okay, we could argue, and we have argued, the various merits of both of those, but I'm sure one of those will tick the boxes for most people.
Yeah, but that's not very much flesh. So, I mean, let's go straight in, and let me just say I couldn't get any sound to work.
I didn't even try sound. I think I tried briefly, but yeah. Yeah, you're not going to get sound to work, and aspect ratio wise, every widescreen monitor I tried it on, it wasn't having it. I've got a 4:3 monitor plugged into that, and it worked fine. It's very old school like that, isn't it?
It certainly involves a lot more digging around and poking about than most modern distros do, which is kind of what I was alluding to in some ways. I mean, you need to use boot codes to enable a lot of the functionality, and if you've got a particularly slow box, for instance, as the wait on USB devices code you'll need, and you'll certainly probably want that if you're trying to run this in a virtual box, for instance. Although, in fairness, it doesn't really make much sense running in a virtual box. This is designed, I think, to be, I'm going to say distribution, I'm sorry, a distribution that you plug in on a box, and you boot to it, you use it, and when you turn off, you plug it in again, and you start and clean again. I kind of get the impression, although they provide all these different options for persistence, and I think they're slightly confusing the amount of options there are there, that they are thinking, basically, you're going to start clean every time.
Yeah, that was the feeling I got for it, because I tried to get persistence going, and I struggled, really. It wants to run in RAM. It wants to install things to RAM. It doesn't really make it easy for you to run things from a disk, be it external or internal. And I suppose it comes around to what is this for? Who is it aimed at? The question that we always ask, this is a tool, and what job is that tool for? Well, for me, an obvious use case is I've got a ThinkPad, an A20M, for any ThinkPad geeks out there. This is an IBM ThinkPad, so that tells you a little bit of its age. It's got a 500 megahertz processor, I think a Celeron M, and 256 megabytes of RAM that I maxed out at one point years and years ago. And I actually had Debian running on there with Mate when I turned it on. That must have been months ago that I was playing around with that. And I installed FLWM on there just to see what it would be like. And it was fast and everything. But then having run TinyCore on there and installed it to the hard disk, which if you do that, your mileage is going to vary. And I suppose I could get back to that. But suffice to say, it doesn't play nicely with other distros. It's not easy to install. Despite it being a relatively simple installer, it seemed to fail sometimes, and I just didn't really want to do it. But once I had it running on this old laptop, it was incredibly fast. But trying to install things, I kept hitting that 256 megabyte limit. And I'm sure that if I'd worked harder and read more, I could have got proper persistence on the hard drive working, but that's just not what it wanted me to do. It wanted me to run from RAM. And so that's kind of the paradox of it, really. On the one hand, it would be perfect for an ancient machine like that came running Windows 98 in the first place, to have a modern application like Firefox or Chromium running and be able to access the web. But at the same time, it's because it's running in RAM, it's hindered by that limit. So it's kind of in a bit of a no man's land. I'm not really sure, is this just a proof of concept, or is it supposed to be used on a daily basis? And if so, on what, by whom?
I wondered about the RAM usage, because I thought that maybe when this came out, that the amount of RAM on desktops was obviously going to be a lot less than it is now, and therefore it was that small so that it could load into RAM and load useful applications, and therefore the amount of RAM that we have now, you know, measured in multiple gigs, if not tens of multiple, would be just oceans of available RAM for it to swim in. But it sounds like it actually uses a lot more as a base install, and once you've installed a few programs, than I'd given it credit for. So I mean, I've got 2 gig of RAM, and at no point did it ever complain about size or space or anything.
Yeah, and they do make allowance for this sort of situation, I think, because, I mean, I dragged you off talking about the app installer a little while back, Jesse, and it's probably worth returning to that. But, I mean, that offers several options for whether applications that you download should be just kept for this session or kept in persistently, but more particularly whether they should be loaded on boot if they are kept persistently, or only loaded when you actually try and access them. So you can set it up so you've got persistent apps there that don't automatically get copied over into RAM and therefore occupying any of it when you first boot.
But it's not very intuitive, is it? If you don't read the documentation, it doesn't make a lot of sense, that package manager.
I don't think it does, to be honest. I mean, the documentation is one of the very best things about TinyCore, if you can find it. They've got a little book there that's 160 odd pages long in PDF format. And if you read that, it'll explain everything about how to use the distro, how it's put together, and some potential use cases. And I thought it was really excellent documentation. But you do have to read it 3 or 4 times if you're new to the concepts, because it doesn't behave like any other distribution that you're used to. And it seems to have multiple ways of doing very similar things. They're all slightly different, but they're very similar in concept.
Yeah, next time you find some really useful documentation that's difficult to find, would you share it with everyone else? Because I have it in my notes that the documentation was pretty difficult, but I only looked at the descriptions that are online, maybe the FAQ and the wiki and things like this, and they are very short. I mean, I understood where we were going, and like you say, once I'd got my head around how to get the persistence working and how to install so that things installed at boot or not, it made sense, but it was a bit of headbanging and walls, so not ideal.
Yeah, well, if you go to the website, the link next to FAQ is book.
Oh, yeah.
But it's fairly easy to miss. I can see that.
So installing applications, when you open apps, which for all intents and purposes is the software center or Synaptic for equivalence, the first time you load it, it asks you if you want to search for the fastest mirror, very sensible. And then when in there, you can browse this list. But the list it doesn't have a vast amount of applications. Generally, it's a case of searching for the one that you want, selecting the application you want to install, and then, as Joe was just saying, that you pick where you want to install it. So generally, I installed it to load at boot. A couple of them I tested to install, but only load when you actually go to use it. And I would say I had a 50-50 success, maybe better than that, actually, maybe 70-30 success with things installing. But when they don't install, it just says failed. And I had no real way of teasing out what had failed or why or what I was missing. And so I found it a little bit difficult to use.
Well, that's the headline here, isn't it? TinyCore is difficult to use. I suppose probably not if you read the documentation, but I'm not one for doing that. I'm one for trying it out, trying to work it out logically first, and then go into the documentation. And there are a lot of distros these days that are very, very intuitive, whereas this is just not, is it? If you don't read the documentation, then you're not going to get very far with it.
Well, are they intuitive, or are they just the same as what you already know?
Isn't that the same thing?
Yeah, but intuitive implies that if someone gave you something you'd never seen before, you'd be able to work out how it would function. Whereas if you're loading LXDE and XFCE on an Ubuntu base, of course you're going to know how they work because they're basically the same. Whereas this is a fundamental sort of concept shift in how you use it and run it.
Well, I would take issue and say that I'm not one for reading documentation generally, unless I absolutely have to. And I modeled my way through for years using Ubuntu, Xubuntu, Lubuntu, Debian, Fedora. And I can't remember ever having to resort to the documentation because they were all relatively straightforward and intuitive. So I think it is fair to say that TinyCore is not intuitive and is fairly difficult. And there is a fairly high barrier to entry.
Yes, when you explain it that way, that's true, because I did find myself, more than if I'm installing something which is outside of my comfort zone of Ubuntu. So if we're looking at Fedora or OpenSUSE or something, I rarely have to go back to the website to find the documentation on the thing I want to do. It's often that I can, like I say, muddle through. With this, I had a second screen up at all times, searching through the TinyCore FAQs or browsing Google and things like this to try and find it. On the app installer, I mean, let's say they go well, all well and good. I installed Firefox as well. And what I quite liked about the Firefox install is that it basically downloads a script, which then runs, and the script is what you install from the apps. And when it runs, it finds the latest Firefox version and then downloads that. And I sort of wonder why this isn't a more common way of installing applications. Why isn't there a script that always goes to the most recent download from the originator's website and then pulls it down and installs it? That seems like a more sensible way of dealing with these things.
You haven't used Windows for a while, have you?
Quite a long time.
Because that's pretty much how it goes. If you install something like Skype, it'll be a tiny little binary that then goes out and fetches the latest version. So they don't have to keep updating that. They can just keep updating the version that they have sitting on the server.
This Windows thing sounds quite good, actually, yeah.
Windows, GNOME. What are you doing on this show, man?
Well, I'll tell you what, something that Windows doesn't have, and I don't think any other desktop environment I've ever seen has, is that on the Windows there's no maximize button. There's maximize left to right and maximize top to bottom as independent buttons, and that confused me for a while. I could never work out which one was which. It was really bizarre picking widthways fully or top to bottom fully. And something I know that you've mentioned before, I think it was Puppy Linux you have a problem with. There's no password for sudo, so everything is run as root.
Well, no, that's not necessarily the case. You're conflating two different ideas there. In Puppy, you are literally running as root all the time, whereas with this, it's passwordless sudo. So the security practices are not tip-top, I will give you that, but it is not quite as bad as Puppy.
Okay, and maybe their argument would be because it reboots and it reboots afresh, it's a 0 install every single time you restart, so you can sort of, I don't want to say get away with that, but it's a different sort of paradigm from having it installed to your hard disk, and therefore any security concerns constantly arise every time you boot.
Yeah, who cares if someone totally compromises your system? Just reboot, problem solved. What a great security model. Yeah. No, I do take your point, and I was wondering about that. And Puppy, I think, is a fair comparison, I suppose. It runs on fairly similar hardware. But I would say TinyCore is slightly more secure, probably. But that's totally unqualified opinion. So how we always end these things is with me asking, are you going to use this? And can you see yourself finding a use case for it? And in my case, I'm really not sure that beyond a curiosity, it has much of a use for me.
Yeah, I'd have to mirror that. It's interesting to have seen it and the way that it runs, and will boot the applications every single time it loads if you've put them into the persistent storage and you ask for it to load them every time. It's an odd way of doing it, but it's not something I can, we're not going to use it as a daily driver desktop, are we? So I'm not sure it has many other use cases other than that.
Yeah, and I'm afraid I'm going to agree with both of you, so we've got a clean sweep of scepticism here. I mean, what struck me really about the whole thing was it's trying to be very small, but it's still based on X. And I've never really understood why someone doesn't try and make a small distro that runs against the frame buffer. And I know that's kind of gone out of fashion these days, actually using the frame buffer. When you're talking about these little, basically single-user distributions where you aren't having multiple people accessing it at once, and that's what we're talking about here with the security models and everything, why someone isn't making a distro like that, or if they are, I've never come across it, and I'm happy to be corrected by the listeners, but why there isn't a distro like that out there, I don't know, because that is what I would imagine something like TinyCore ought to be.
Well, you never know. There might be one, or there might be someone working on one, and as Paddy said, we'd love to hear about it. But with that, we come to the end of another Linux Luddites. You can email us at show@linuxluddites.com, find us on Twitter or at the Google Plus and Facebook communities, or leave a comment on the website. Thanks for joining me, Paddy and Jesse, and thanks to everyone for listening. We'll see you again in 2 weeks with more Linux news, reviews, comment, and generally being grumpy.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, Diddly Poms.
See you later.
They're really small. Really, really small.
Fantastic.